In Perek Gimel, we're in chapter 3. We started it a little bit last week. Chapter 3 is a big chapter. There's a lot going on, and we're not going to wrap it this week. It's gonna flow right into next week, because there's just no other way around it. I do expect, just for reference, that we're going to take the planned 2 Tuesdays off the following. In other words, today is the 8th. We're on the 8th. We're on the 15th. We'll be off 22nd and 29th, and then back on in the beginning of January. Okay. So we are, as I said, in Perek Gimel in chapter 3. We were talking at the end last time about the elevation of Haman. So today's session, first of all, overall, as always, our learning for the year is dedicated by Dana and Ilan Rubenstein, and this session in particular is associated with the following gifts from our Day of Giving that we held in July, from Chaim and Tammy Rutman, from Asher and Bonnie Saban, and Jack and Marla Samuel. And also, Susan noted that she has yahrzeit tonight for her father, Chaim Eliezer ben Meir B'chaya. The neshama should have an aliyah. So we asked some questions last time about the elevation of Haman. We wanted to know who held the position before Haman, what was Haman's position before he was elevated, why give Haman so much power, and we noted that there doesn't seem to be a predecessor. This seems to be a new position, although maybe not, right? We talked about the fact that we don't know, everybody's positions beforehand in the Megillah. We only get information on a need-to-know basis. But we suggested that perhaps this position that Haman gets of being in charge of everything was an attempt after the assassination for Achashverosh to put someone in charge who will be loyal to him and have a lot of power. And Yoram Chazoni sharpened that idea by saying it's to tame the intrigues of the court. And that was one theory. Second theory that I offered was to look back at Daniel chapter 6, in which someone put a note in the chat, I see. Yes. So Carla, I think actually that book may be an older one, the one that you noted in the chat. But I'm not sure of that. I think that was actually an older version. But in any case, the second theory was that what Achashverosh is doing is withdrawing in fear after the assassination attempt. Hence the idea that no one comes into Achashverosh uninvited. Haman becomes the external projection of the power of Achashverosh, and Achashverosh doesn't have to deal with anybody. And it was sort of the opposite of Darius the Mede in Daniel chapter 6, in which there's an attempt to make everybody come to the king. In this case, it's make everybody stay away. And I noted that we're going to see another approach to the elevation of Haman from Malbim below, which won't exclude the first two ideas, but will add a different facet. So we'll have to come back to that. All right. But why Haman? Why do you want Haman in particular in charge? So there are two tracks found in the Midrashim and in the commentaries. The tracks can be made to work with each other, actually. It doesn't have to be that they're mutually exclusive. But let's go, step by step here. Your first approach is that the story of Haman is a rags to riches story. Haman was a nobody, and he became a somebody. If you take a look on your sheet at source number 3, source number 1 was just the piece from the Dawn. Carla confirms in the chat that the book God and Politics in Esther is actually a new version of this. It's newer than the Dawn. Okay. But in source 1, I brought you the piece from Hazoni that we saw last week. For source number 2, I gave you the reference to Daniel chapter 6 and the story with Darius the Mede. But take a look at number 3, a Gemara in Megillah. Very hard to understand. Tana, we have learned. Haman sapar shel kfar kartzum haya esrim ushtayim shana. Haman was the barber of a town called Kfar Kartzum. Kfar, generally speaking, is understood to be an outlying village. For 22 years. We also have a medrash that suggests that Haman had actually been a servant of Mordechai. Now, lest anyone ask the question of how do you know that sapar here means barber? Maybe it's a reference to a teacher, because in fact we use the term safra to refer to a teacher at times, not to mention you have sofer, of course, which is a scribe. In context in the Gemara, it's actually really clear that it's a barber, because they present it in terms of his preparation of Mordechai he's the valet for Mordechai when he's going to go out on his parade, and that he grooms him because he has experience as a barber. So sapar here is not sofer, it's not a teacher, it's not a scribe, he be a barber. And the question you have to ask is, where did this come from? Why would the Medrash take this approach to explain what Haman was doing before he became the vizier of Paro? What would you say? Where is this coming from? Like, why a barber? Do we know any barbers in Tanakh?
There's a fascinating story that's related. Harry Truman's barber was a Jewish person, and that Jewish person is credited a great deal with Harry Truman's support for the state of Israel, which he would not otherwise have had.
I thought it was Harry Truman's partner in the haberdashery who was Jewish, who had the influence.
You might be right. That may be wrong.
Yeah, but we like barbers. I mean, I'm not against barbers, but I don't think it was Truman's barber. No, but the question fundamentally here is, like, where did this come from? I mean, we have Yosef when he's going to be brought before Paro, not this coming week's parasha, but the ensuing one. So vayigalach, so he shaves. So we have barbering, but like, where did this come from? So on a simple textual level, it's what I mentioned before, that he gets Mordechai ready for the parade, so he's grooming him. He is his valet. But the message in this story, I think, is, number one, to insult Haman. In other words, this is a put down to Haman. With due respect to barbers, because I don't mean to insult them, but the Gemara does. What the Gemara is doing is it's saying Haman was somebody who was not from the upper echelons. He was, in fact, a barber. And number two, it also highlights the role of God in the story. To say, who would have thought such a thing, that a barber would become in charge of the entire kingdom, this empire that controls the known and civilized world? How could that possibly have happened? The answer is, this is God elevating the lowly and bringing down the great. That's another possible message of this. If you read it that way, go back to the beginning of chapter 3. The sentence began, the chapter began, Achar ha'devarim ha'eleh. After these things, Achashverosh elevated, and so on. And the way you'd read it is, after the assassination attempt, Achashverosh was in fear, as we've said already. He looks for somebody who is lowly, who will depend on him, right? And that's why he gets the gig. Achashverosh wants somebody who doesn't have connections. Achashverosh wants somebody who doesn't owe anything to anybody else. He just owes his existence politically to Achashverosh. So he picks random barber and says, you're going to run the kingdom now. That's the take here. He's taking somebody who knows no one, doesn't really have any connections, and will depend on him, not unlike, of course, the selection of Esther. That's one way to read Achar HaDevarim Ha'eleh. After the assassination attempt, he elevated the nobody. Or, alternatively, take a look, please, at... there it is. Source number 4. The Gemara in Megillah. Achar ha-devarim ha'ela. After these things. My achar. What do you mean after? Amar Rava achar shabara hakadosh baruch hu refuah lamaka. After God prepared the cure for the wound. Meaning, after Esther was selected, after Mordechai saved Achashverosh from the plot, then Haman was elevated out of nowhere, which is going to hurt us, but that's okay because all the pieces are now in place. That's how the Gemara reads the achar, the after. That's all one view. Okay, this is all one school of thought that says Haman is coming out of nowhere as Achashverosh's response to his fear / after the refuah, the cure is already in place. That's all one track. But you can offer a second track. And the Gemara itself offers you the second track as well. This is a really important point, which I'm going to take a moment just to unpack, because I think I should. We're about to see a Gemara that's going to apparently disagree with the Gemara we just read about Haman being a barber. Take a look at source number 5. Tana, we've learned, Mimuchan ze Haman. Mimuchan was Haman. Who was Mimuchan? Don't say Haman. That's not my point. Who was Mimuchan before this in the book?
He was the one who suggested Vashti be killed.
Yeah, he was the one who said off with her head. So Mimuchan is Haman. This suggests. Now, you could harmonize that with what we saw in source number 3 and say, okay, so he's had a varied career, right? He was a barber for 22 years. Then he became a politician. And eventually he became an advisor to Achashverosh. Like, you could make that work. I've actually read articles that say that in Persian / Greek / Roman times, the barbershop was also a place where people talked politics. So you get powerful people there in the barbershop, and you're talking through the issues of the day, and maybe he becomes important in that way. It was also a place for medicine, although I don't really see that fitting in the Megillah. You're right. Bloodletting, was the barber's trade. But the... One second, Jules. Sorry? No, we do not know much about Kfar Kartsum. No, I looked around for it. There are actually multiple versions of the text in terms of the name of the place, and there are other texts in the Midrashim that provide other place names which we do know more about, but I haven't seen anything substantive like, oh, okay, this is now going to give me insight into why they're identifying him as that. That I have not seen. Yes, Jules?
Why would
someone's buzzing.
Be there? Why would the politicians, it doesn't sound like it's in the center of things to have connections with these higher echelons.
Yeah, no, it really doesn't. It really doesn't seem to position him that way. I would agree with that statement. Yes, Jules?
Is it significant that Memuchan in the Megillah is a kriyokativ?
So I'm getting to that. You asked me about that a few weeks ago, and I told you I was going to come back to it. I wasn't lying to you. So we're about to see it. Just give me one more moment, and we'll have it. Yes, Alan.
Does Memuchan mean expert?
So different word. It's a good question. A mumche is an expert, but it's with a chet, not a chaf. And the chet is part of the root. So I wouldn't connect the two. But, sorry? Oh, no, mumche won't help you in this regard. So mumche is not an association there, no. But what is an association, and finally, we get back to your kriyuktiv question. If you take a look at source number 6, Medrash in the Psikta, Vayomer Mimuchan. This is commenting on chapter 1, where he gives the advice about Vashti. Mumchan ktiv. It's written as Mumchan. The vav is before the second mem. Shayemuchan lepuranut. He is prepared for punishment. I gave you in the English, I gave you the transliterated words that will be clear even to those who don't read Hebrew. Muchan. It's a play on mumchan. Muchan, he is prepared for punishment. And then it goes on to say, Mimuchan hediot shebekulan. He was the lowliest of the bunch. Meaning, you had a list of advisors in chapter 1 for Achashverosh. The last one on the list was this fellow Mumchan Mimuchan. He is the lowest of the bunch. And Amar Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana Mikan Shehed Yod Kofetz Barosh. So Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana says, you know what you see here? You see that this guy pushes his way to the front. So that could fit, number one, with the idea that he had been the barber, but it fits even more strongly with the idea that he was the barber and then he became a politician. In other words, this is a guy who is upwardly mobile. He's pushing his way in front. He got himself into the court. Achashverosh has a question. I'm not waiting for anybody else to talk. I'm going to jump in. So you could harmonize the two approaches to Haman, and that's my point here. You could say that, he was a barber, and he was also eventually a politician. You could do that. There's also a version in the Medrash that it was his father who was the barber, not him. But my point here is to say, you could do that, you don't have to. We have competing midrashim all over the place. There's nothing wrong with having two midrashim that present different angles on a story, because remember what the job of Medrash is. Medrash is concerned about harmonizing text. Medrash is not concerned at all about storyline. So you could have multiple ways to harmonize text that will result in different stories.
What's Psikta to Zutrita?
Right, Psikta Zutrita is, Zutra means small in Aramaic. It's the minor Psikta, because we have different volumes of Medrash that are called Psikta. There's Psikta that was taught by Rav Kahana, there's Psikta Rabti, the greater Psikta, and then there's Psikta Zutrita, the minor Psikta. These are all canonized editions of Midrash that appear, I think, roughly between the 6th and 9th century, if I remember correctly, for Psikta.
So it's a synonym for Midrash, Psikta?
No, it's again, Midrash is an approach. It's not a thing. Drash, the approach of analyzing text and trying to give explanations for textual anomalies, is what Midrash does. You have different canonized volumes of Midrash. There's Medrash Rabbah, there's Mechilta, there's Tarat Kohanim, and so on. And Psikta,
It's for Pasuk?
yes, actually, or Piska would be, because it's really an Aramaic term. Piska is a unit of text, or a unit of a teaching. So you have some that's published as Psikta Rabti, Psikta Zutrita, Psikta de Rav Kahana, and so on. So does that help, or does that confuse things
No,
further?
I just never heard. I just want to know what it was.
Okay. So you have this second view, which again does not have to contradict the first, that Haman had been a diplomat first. Why would I take that approach versus just saying he was a barber? What's the advantage of this approach, logically?
You save a lot of time.
What do you mean?
We don't have to go back so far in history. He's always been
Well, he's been somebody before this.
a barber, exactly.
No, but he was somebody before this anyway, whether he's a career diplomat or a barber or some hybrid. What's the advantage of this approach?
Does it help to know that your enemy was an important person, but the person who plotted your destruction was maybe a little more than a barber? Although, I mean, I think for all of us, we just, like, it comes from Hashem, so obviously comes from Hashem. But I think there is a certain amount of that the person who plotted this, was always a person of substance.
Could be.
Kind of fits into...
I'd rather insult him, but I understand.
Yeah, not insulting him, it's just,
No, but I'd rather insult him by saying he had been someone of lowly standing. But I think the advantage of this approach is just that it fits the story better. It's really odd that this fellow, number one, it's odd that Haman comes out of nowhere. Granted, we've now given explanations for why he would do it. Nonetheless, it's not the way things normally work. Number two, Mimuchan disappears. He's a really important advisor in chapter 1, and he never shows up again. Where did he go? So now I have an answer. The answer is he's the same as Haman. We have plenty of people in Tanakh who have multiple names. This is another example of it. it explains more also about Haman as a person. It explains why he would give this odd advice to Achashverosh of get rid of Vashti back in chapter 1. The answer is he's a power-hungry guy. And he figures, the more people I get rid of, the higher up on the ladder I am. And so maybe that fits. And it can fit with Achar HaDvarim HaEle. Again, like we said, after all these pieces are in place, then Haman gets elevated. But again, I said to you that we are going to have another idea. Malbim has an intriguing idea. It's somebody else in the story. It's not Mimuchan. He's not working with Haman being Mimuchan, but rather he's somebody else we find who is Mehuman. Sounds closer to Haman, doesn't it? Who is Mehuman in the book of Esther? Go back to chapter 1, sentence 10. He was the first one on the council. Right? He's the one Achashverosh came to first to ask, what do I do about Vashti? He didn't get to speak up. Mehuman was Mumchan was the one who spoke up. Right? So Malbim says, that's who was elevated. And if you will ask me, so why did he get elevated? Malbim has an incredibly creative read, which gives a new way to understand Achar HaDvarim HaEle, after these things. Take a look at source number 7, please, on your sheet. Right? Does everyone have the sheet? People got it out of the email? Okay. Take a look at source number 7. Be'arua mefarshim, the commentators explain, Ki achar shishkach me'achashverosh Esther higida zos b'shem Mordechai. After Achashverosh forgot that I think, Janine, you got someone at the door. After Achashverosh forgot that the story that Esther told him about Bigtan and Teresh came from Mordechai, Achashverosh wanted to reward those who helped him. So who does he want to reward? He wants to reward Esther. He doesn't know who Esther told it from. He forgot that piece. He just thinks Esther saved my life. I want Esther to be happy. But he has nothing to offer her. Could have offered her half the kingdom. Nonetheless, Malbim says he has nothing to offer Esther. He said, but this is going to make her happy. Esther. Sharishon misarisav hayam mehuman. V'yatzahu levakesh lo naros besulos val yado nasas Esther v'lochein ha'elahu al bamase'av. He says, you know what? Mehuman was the head of his advisors. The advisors who told him that he should seek girls to come to the palace. Now, he doesn't mention this here, but he's also the one whose counsel said to get rid of Vashti. Right? You've got that as well. He's putting him with the Sarisim of chapter 2, which is interesting, and we discussed them already last time or 2 weeks ago. I'm not coming back to those Sarisim. But the point is, and what I'm trying to suggest, what Malbim is trying to suggest here is, he elevates Mehuman to become important in the kingdom because he thinks that Esther will be happy about that. That's the idea. He thinks that Esther will see that as a move to elevate somebody who was her supporter. That's the idea. I'm going to continue in my English translation just in the interest of time because I don't want to spend the whole time on this Malbim. But take a look at the second paragraph in the English in source number 7. Also, after Achashverosh forgot who exposed Bigtan and Teresh, it was easy for Haman, for whom the time was fortuitous, to introduce into the king's heart that he had been the one to tell it. In other words, he says, oh yeah, I told Esther. Where he gets this idea, where Malbim gets this idea, I don't know yet. Therefore he elevated him such that Haman wore a garment that was not his own. The honor was truly due to Mordechai. But this was caused by God to fall upon the head of the wicked one temporarily until the time would come to return the crown to its rightful owner. So that's the way that Malbim reads it. There's only one catch with this. Devi, you're shaking your head. What do you see as the catch?
You're changing the story to suit your theory. It's like some of this COVID stuff. You have a theory, and then you get unfacts to prove the theory. It's ridiculous.
Which theory is he adopting that he needs to change things for? Sorry?
Who it was who recommended Esther. That's ridiculous. Where does it come from?
Well, where it comes from is the fact that in chapter 2, he gets advice from his Sarisim, who tell him that he should not recommend Esther, but that he should hold this whole competition in the first place. So what he is suggesting is that it was done in order to make Esther happy. He's trying to make Esther happy by having the one who gave him the idea of holding the whole competition. I agree that it's weak because it was a different group of advisors in chapter 2. What's interesting about it is that it gives a new explanation for the connection between the assassination attempt and the elevation of Haman, in addition to the ideas we floated earlier. The weakness with all of this is really in the text itself. And I mentioned it last week and called it to your attention then, but I want to call it to your attention again because, it matters, which is, when is Haman actually elevated? What hint do we have in chapter 3 as to when Haman is elevated? No, we have a better one. We have a date. Chapter 3, sentence 7. Year 12. Right? We don't know that that's exactly when he got the position, but it sounds like it, because everybody's supposed to bow. He walks around by the gate. Mordechai won't bow, right? And everything happens, bang, bang, bang. It's all one after the other. This is year 12. When was the assassination attempt? We don't know. We're not told. But Esther was selected back in year 7. That we knew. So it sounds like there's a gap. I can't prove that there is a gap. You can make the argument that there is not a gap. You can make the argument that maybe Esther was picked in year 7, and in year 12 was the assassination attempt, and in year 12 was when Haman gets elevated. But Ibn Ezra says explicitly that it's not so. I didn't bring Ibn Ezra on your sheet, but Ibn Ezra in the beginning of the chapter believes that actually this is 5 years later. So how could it be that he's elevating Haman in response to the assassination attempt? Whether it's to reward Esther or whether it's out of fear. How do any of the theories work? Hazoni's theory, the Malbim's theory. So the answer must lie with source number 7, the last bit of source number 7, and I know Moish likes this idea because he emailed me about it. The last bit of source number 7. He elevated and he raised him. If you look carefully at the text in chapter 3, sentence 1, it says, Gidal hamelach Achashverosh et Haman. He made him gadol, he made him big. Vayinaseehu, and he elevated him. It is the way of kings not to elevate a common person suddenly, from the lowest rank to the highest rank. Therefore, he elevated him rank by rank. In other words, he's moving Haman up. It's not all at once. So it's possible that he starts to do it in year 7, but it takes time before Haman is at the top of the heap, and the Megillah is just not interested in giving us 5 years of history that doesn't really add anything to our knowledge of the story. It's a gradual elevation to prevent rejection by the people. So what does all of this add in our understanding of the themes of the book? If I take the first approach, the rags to riches approach, he was a barber and then he's the vizier. So the Medrash is teaching me that even Haman's elevation is part of a divine plan. He went from being nothing to becoming something, and it's all God making things work. If I take the second approach, that he was an opportunist advisor who saw his chance to grab power, so then maybe it's just a general message about seeking power. You can make that argument, certainly. You could really read it either way. But then we get to the bowing. Mordechai refuses to bow. So that's chapter 3, sentence 2. And what we're told is, V'chol avdei hamelach asher b'shar hamelach, all of the king's servants who are at the king's gate, which we established last week as a big active place for all the people who want to get involved and all of the potential advisors, real advisors, potential advisors, all of them are supposed to bow to Haman. Korim umishtachavim laHaman, they kneel and bow to Haman, ki chen tziva lo hamelech, because that was the command the king gave. Mordechai lo yichrav lo yishtachaveh. But now Mordechai, he's not kneeling, he's not bowing. And the big question you have to ask is, why? In Tanakh, all sorts of righteous people bow to other human beings. And not only to other human beings, but to people who are of no particular spiritual standing at all. I gave you, in source number 8, I gave you references elsewhere in, just from Bereshit. We're not going to look them up right now. I'll tell you what they refer to. Chapter 18, sentence 2 in Bereshit is Abraham and his 3 visitors. They may be malachim, but Abraham doesn't know that at that point. To Abraham, they're just visitors, 3 guys out of the wilderness, and he bows to them. Chapter 23, sentence 7 is Abraham and the people of Chet, the Hittites, when he wants to get a grave for Sarah. Chapter 33, sentence 3, last week's Torah portion. Yaakov bows to Esav. Granted, he's criticized there, but the criticism he receives is because he's being obsequious. It's not like he violated a prohibition by bowing to Esav. And then the last one, chapter 42, sentence 6, is when the Shvatim, the tribes, bowed to the viceroy in Egypt, who of course is Yosef, but they don't know that. But none of them had any trouble bowing. Why is Mordechai refusing to bow? And not only is he refusing to bow, jump to chapter 5, sentence 9, please. Professor Yonatan Grossman points this out. Chapter 5, sentence 9, is talking about when Haman has been invited to Esther's party. This is after there's a decree to wipe out all the Jews. And after Mordechai has gone to Esther and said, endanger your life in order to go before the king. And Esther says, I can't do it, I'm scared. Fine, I'll do it, but have a 3-day fast. Haman comes out of the palace, and there is Mordechai, and lo and behold, v'lo kam v'lo zami menu, he ain't budging. Really? Even when, you can make the argument that in chapter 3, Mordechai doesn't realize that this is going to endanger every single Jew on the planet. But now you know. What's your excuse? Why does Mordechai refuse to bow? It doesn't make any sense. So, yes, Jeanette.
I just want to ask a question. In all those examples that you gave from Tanakh, were there any examples when they were demanded? In other words, when someone said, bow to me?
Nope.
So that seems to me to be a very big difference.
Why?
Because when someone's saying, bow in front of me, they are trying to make themselves into something, more godlike and demanding something. Whereas if you were on your own, there was a is the bowing to the ground? Is a bow of hello? Just a little bit of a respectful bow. There could be so many differences. But it's a big deal if it's not demanded.
But it's not. Demanding respect isn't the same as making oneself a god. We have a very specific definition of idolatry. There's a fellow who keeps on emailing me. He's been emailing me for months now, arguing that the whole mask phenomenon is avodah zarah. It's idolatry because you're not allowed to show honor to anything other than to God. It's like, dude, that's not what avodah zarah is. Idolatry has nothing to do with showing honor to people. It means elevating something and saying this is the creator. So while I understand that it may rub Mordechai the wrong way if someone is demanding that kind of honor, there's a long way from that to saying, well, I can't bow to you, I'm Jewish. This is difficult. So we're going to see two approaches.
Can I say something?
You bet, Ellen. Go ahead.
No, I see in the Stone Tanakh, just quoting Ibn Ezra, saying that Haman's robes were decorated with idols.
So we're going to get to that. That's why I always say, Susan knows my rule. Don't quote me commentators who are found in your editions because we're going to get to them, or we'll specifically ignore them.
It goes with Malvin, who had said that he got a garment that was not his own.
Oh, garment not his own. Right. Malvin was using it as as idiomatic. But yes, I hear you. Garment not his own. Clever. Okay. Moish had his hand up.
Hi, how are you doing? Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can't see.
Okay. Yes, okay. Okay, no problem. I think that Mordechai was betting the house that what Haman had planned, and his thinking they would never be more prepared or in a better position to fight him off than they were right now. So he sort of brought forward Haman's plan because he was ready. Like you said, they're ready. We're ready. Do it.
But on what basis would you say that the people are in any way, shape, or form prepared for this?
No, because he's ready. Esther's ready. They'll never be in a better position to do what they did, which was totally change the intrigue to make it against Haman.
But why do you need to?
What do you mean, why do you need to?
Why can't Mordechai allow Haman to be in place in the
But that's
kingdom?
not the problem. The problem is not Mordechai's bowing. What I'm saying is, maybe I should have said this before, he understands what Haman's long-range plan is, and that is the destruction and murder of all the Jews. The issue is not in bowing or now. Bowing is like bringing it forward.
So that's a creative read, but if you read the text itself, Haman is not doing anything to Jews until Mordechai starts up with him.
If you thought, well, not really. Not really, because you can't, it's very difficult to tell from the Pesukim that anything other than what I've suggested actually happens. It's not because of Mordechai. Sorry, it is because of Mordechai. But he knows what Haman's like.
Okay, so maybe I'm going to ask you for evidence of that going along, but I want to promote two approaches with this, and if you can find me evidence that Haman has a thing for Jews separate from this, I would love to see it. The first approach, the first approach is indeed that this was a form of avodah zarah, that it's a form of idolatry, and there are different versions of this. The first version of the idolatry approach is the Gemara in Megillah, if you take a look at source number 9. Ma ra'a Mordechai di'ikni behaman. It's based on a verse. I gave you the reference in chapter 8, but it's better that we not spend the time right now to look up the verse it's based on. What did Mordechai see? Di'ikni behaman, that made him anger Haman. Why did Mordechai do this? Al kacha, because of this. Deshavi nafshe avodah zarah. Haman made himself a foreign god. Not just demanding bow to me, show me respect, but actually a deity. The Gemara in Sanhedrin in source number 10 offers us this as well. The Gemara here is having a little bit of a complicated discussion, which I think we can work with. Question is this: if a Jew is told, bow to the idol, and if you don't, I'm going to hurt you, is that really called avodah zarah? Is that called idolatry? You don't believe in it. You're just going through the motions. And it's a debate between Abaye and Rava. So I'm going to work with my English translation in source number 10, rather than confuse people doubly with the Hebrew. One who serves a foreign god out of love meaning you like the person who made the idol, or fear, you're afraid, if I don't do this, I'm going to get hurt. Not hurt because it's a god, but hurt by somebody else. So Abaye says, liable. Abaye says, I don't care what your motivations are. You can't bow to idols. That's just not allowed. Rava says, pater, he says, no, you're exempt from liability. ... Abaye said, what's my source? How do I know this? So he says, we have a brisa. We have the following lesson. The Torah says regarding idolatry, do not bow to idols. Lo tishtachav elohem. Don't bow to them. Don't bow to them, but you can bow to people who are like you. There's nothing wrong with bowing to a human being, like the examples that we saw in source number 8. Feel free. Don't bow to idols, but you can bow to people. Then the brisa asks, the lesson that Abaye is quoting asks, even if the person is worshipped, like Haman, you're still allowed to do that? No. Because the text says, don't worship them. That means if the person declares himself like an idol, you're not allowed to. So that's his quote. He says, look, people are only bowing to Haman out of fear. They're not really accepting him. And yet, it's still prohibited. Look at that, Abaye says. To which Rava responds, no, that's not the idea. That's not what they were doing with their comparison to Haman. Haman was actually worshipped as a foreign god. He wasn't just a person who was elevating himself. Haman actually was set up as a god. What does that mean? I'm not going to go through the rest of source number 10 right now because it's not going to further our goals. Hang on, Susan, just a minute. Take a look at the Malbim in source number 11 where he tries to explain what this is about by referring you back to Greco-Roman culture. I'm not so sure that what he's saying applies to Persian culture as well, but certainly Greco-Roman it does. Take a look at number 11, and again, we'll read my translation. Regarding the reason why Mordechai refused to bow to him, commentators have explained that it was because such bowing would be a form of accepting divinity. For you to bow to Haman is like accepting him as a god. Thus, the early nations, believers in illusions, ascribed to anyone who was found to possess a greater level of wisdom, or might, or wealth, that he was a son of the gods, or that a particular star or celestial force influenced him. As it said of Nebuchadnezzar, with Daniel, when Daniel explains his dreams, and he worshipped Daniel and said offerings should be brought before him. Therefore, Mordecai refused to do this as a Jew. In other words, hang on, give one more minute, Susan. What Malbim is suggesting is that the Gemara is saying Haman has himself, or Achashverosh has Haman elevated as someone of unique powers, which must be divine in origin. Yes, Susan.
That doesn't fit with Achashverosh's personality that we've told us so far. It's all wrong. Achashverosh, we said, was power hungry. He had to stand up. That's why he made the party and all of this. How could Haman then, that would put Haman over Achashverosh because Haman would be looked at as a god. So, and Achashverosh isn't.
Fair point. Definitely a fair point. You could respond that he's still Achashverosh's pet god. Meaning, he does what Achashverosh tells him to do, so it's okay for him to be a god. You could make that argument.
But it falls flat when we think of Achashverosh and the party and getting all those people from all the countries to come and see him.
Yeah.
Him.
You're right. You're right. And I think the main motivation for this is really that our back is against the wall and trying to understand why Mordechai did this. If you take a look at source number 12, Rashi says it straight out. Rashi says, Sha'asa atzmo avodah zara kedamar b'Megillah. He quotes source number 9 that Haman made himself like an idol. De'i lav hachi, because if it were not so, lo hava Mordechai mitzgara bo v'haya kareu mishtachava lo. Mordechai wouldn't have started up with him. It's not so much that I have evidence for Haman holding himself as a god, as I can't conceive of another explanation for why Mordechai is starting up with him. That's really where this comes from, even though you're right. It strains credibility in terms of why Achashverosh would put him in that position. Agreed. There's another version of this, and Ellen quoted it from Ibn Ezra, but Ibn Ezra himself was quoting source number 13, the Madrash in Esther Rabbah, which says, Ma asa Haman. What did Haman do? Asa lo tselem merukam al begadav. He embroidered a form on his clothes, like a statue, but it's embroidered. Valibo on his chest. Anyone who bowed to Haman was bowing to the foreign god. Going back towards where Moshe was and his theory on all of this, that Haman doesn't like the Jews already from beforehand. That medrash in context seems to think that Haman was doing this in order to get Jews into this position of, if we bow to him, then we're bowing to idols. So that would fit with Moshe's view of Haman. Jeanette writes in the chat, you could explain it if Achashverosh hid himself away in fear and didn't know. The problem is that actually the text said that Achashverosh was the one who commanded people to bow to him, to Haman. So that's hard. But Tosfos likes this idea that he has the idol on his chest. Ibn Ezra likes the idea that he has the idol on his chest. Tell me something. The idea that there is somebody with an idol on his chest and he wants you to bow to him, what does this sound like to you? No. Historically, what does this sound like to you? Does this not sound like the priest walking around with the cross around his neck?
It's also the story of Zimri that sold.
Leave aside the Midrash about Zimri. I'm also leaving aside the Midrash about Goliath, that Goliath had such a thing around his chest also. I wonder how much of this Midrash is a polemic regarding Christianity and and walking around with the with the cross around his neck, and people have to kiss it and so forth. I wonder about that.
Were Jews forced to bow down to the priests, or is this just that they had to kiss it? Because I never learned that they had to bow down to priests.
So I don't know about bowing. But I do know that you were expected to do something to pay obeisance to this cross. So we have so far.
Wasn't that way after this time, the Greek Orthodox or the Orthodox priest walking around? That's modern history.
I'm saying it's after the Megillah, but it's in the time when but it's in the time that the Medrash would be familiar with. And that's my question: is this a polemic, effectively linking it to something that's later in time? That's what I'm suggesting.
Wasn't the Medrash written before Christianity became so common, and that it sounds almost like in Europe, where they wore a cross.
If you're dealing with Esther Rabbah, I believe, is not canonized until, I want to say, something like 7th or 8th century at the earliest. It's not, the heyday of the church in Europe and persecution of the Jews, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th century. But it's, I'm just floating the idea. Moshe, I see your hand, and I see other hands also, but I want to get through at least this, the Avodah Zarah part of this. There's a whole other school of thought here that I still have to get to. So, the third idea within this school of thought that it's about idolatry is that it wasn't that bowing to Haman would be idolatrous. It wasn't that there was an idol on his chest. It was the issue of appearances. And Tosfot suggests this, linking it to a passage in the Jerusalem Talmud, which I brought you in source number 14. The story of Pappus and Lulinus, two brothers. Now, there are various versions of their story in different situations, but I'm talking about the one in the Yerushalmi here, where we were told, Birabim, afilu mitzvah kala lo yishmalo. If somebody who isn't Jewish comes to you and tries to get you to violate Judaism in public, even if what they want you to do is a relatively minor thing, you don't listen. And their example is, Kigon Lulinus upapus achiv, like Lulinus and his brother Papus. What happened to them? They were given a glass with water in it. But the glass was colored so that it would look like it was wine. And they were told, drink from this so that everybody will think that you're drinking non-kosher wine. You're drinking wine from the Romans, even though what you're drinking is actually going to be water. And they refused to do so. The issue is Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying God's name. We will not allow ourselves to be used to support this idolatrous society. We were not going to be used to support Haman. That's the idea. Professor, sorry.
I was going to say, is this all the Marit Ayin that we learn all the time?
So it's stronger than Marit Ayin, but it's related. Marit Ayin is, I might appear to be doing something wrong. Here, it's that I'm actually contributing to a desecration of God's name because of appearances. Professor Amos Chacham, hang on, Jeanine, I see your hand, but as I said to Moish, I wanted to get through at least this part. The Amos Chacham in the Dam Nikra edition points out something important that supports all of these reads that are idolatry related. Take a look at source number 15. And again, I'll read you my English translation aloud, but I retyped the Hebrew as well, so you can see it there too. One should note that the text says of Haman, kneeling and bowing together. Kriya v'hishtachavaya. We have not found this combination in Scripture other than regarding God alone. In other words, all the cases I brought you in source number 8 are just lihishtachavot. Here, it's korea umishtachave, kneeling and bowing. And he says that's only regarding God. We have not even found kneeling alone before a human ruler. Only in honor of God or a prophet or when the idolaters do it for their deity. So that supports the idea that this was a religious act. It wasn't just a display of respect. It was meant to be a religious act. And that explains why Mordechai refuses to bow, and not only that. If this is year 12 in the kingdom, Mordechai has been at the king's gate before. There was never any issue of bowing with anybody else. So it could be that nobody else ever demanded bowing. But it also could be that Haman is doing something different. He's making it a religious act. It also explains something else. Go back to chapter 3, and specifically in sentence 3, the servants of the king at the king's gate say, "What are you doing? Why are you breaking the rules?" And they say this to him day after day, and he's not listening, and they tell Haman, "Let's see what's going on here." They say, "What are you going to do about it?" Because he told them, "I am from Yehud." Everybody knew Mordechai was from Yehud. Ish Yehudi haya b'Shushan habira. Right? Mordechai stands out that way. Malbim even thought that's how he got his position at the royal gate. So what do you mean? Mordechai wasn't simply saying, "I'm a Jew." They knew he was Jewish. Mordechai was saying, "That's why I won't bow." That supports the idea that this is a religious act. This is about idolatry. So we've seen 3 different versions of the idolatry idea. Either that Haman made himself godlike, or that Haman actually had an idol embroidered on his clothing, or this was a concern lest I appear to be doing something towards idolatry. All of it being supported by the religious expression of bowing here, and by Mordechai linking it with his Judaism. However, 2 howevers. However, number 1 is going to be for next week, where we're going to talk about an entirely different way to read this story. There's a whole other approach you can take to Mordechai's refusal that has nothing to do with religion and everything to do with nationalism. But before we get to that, I had to show you this creative approach from Yoram Hazony. I don't think it's correct, but it's a very interesting read. Take a look at source number 16, where I retyped it from the Dawn. He says it's the political system in Persia that elevates Haman above everybody else that is idolatrous. He says, Jews do not refuse to bow before kings or the viziers. Jews refuse to bow before idols. Are we then to understand that Mordechai believed the vizier somehow to be an idol, that he had made of himself a god? When the rabbis retold the story of Mordechai's refusal, they understood such was indeed the case. If we are to fully appreciate the Jews' war against the vizier, a war which opens with a man who will not bend and closes with the deaths of a substantial part of the fighting power of Persia, which, by the way, I disagree with, but you have to wait till chapter 9 to discuss, we must understand the idolatry against which this war was fought. So long as Achashverosh took decisions through broad consultation with a range of advisors, there was every reason to hope that the laws and actions of the Persian state would tend towards at least the roughest approximation of a just settlement among the competing perspectives, interests, and truths in the empire. When you have multiple voices, there's a chance that ultimately you will come to truth. Haman's installation, however, eliminating as it did the action of interests other than his own, in principle suppressed the search for a greater truth on the part of the state. It would become defined by the perspectives and desires of a single man, Haman. His elevation transformed him, and Achashverosh as well, into a usurping god, a pretender to knowledge and power he did not have, an idol. It's a creative read. The idea that it being idolatrous is because one man's perspective and one man's motivations end up running the kingdom. It's very much what I would expect to see from a political scientist. You've taken idolatry in a very different direction. But I definitely wanted to share that because I think it's a fun read. But what we're going to see next time is a different approach. Just to sum up what we've said, and I know there were some hands, so I'll stay on for a few minutes to take the questions and comments. But what we've seen is, number one, two different schools of thought regarding Haman. Are we insulting him, saying to him, you came out of nowhere, you were a barber beforehand, you're not someone of standing? Or, along with that, are we saying this is all from God, otherwise how did the barber end up in charge? / it was churning within the court. He was already somebody. He was Memuchan or he was Mehuman. Maybe Achashverosh was trying to satisfy Esther by elevating Mehuman. Maybe it was just the elevation of this Memuchan who spoke out of turn. We noted the challenge of the lapsing of 5 years, and if this really is a response to the assassination attempt, then why does it take 5 years? Malbim says it's not. It's done over time, this elevation. And then the business of Mordechai refusing to bow, we've given one general approach that this is about idolatry, with a few different versions of what that means, including Hazony's creative political science version of idolatry. And next week, I want to do a few things next week. I'm already very excited for next week. There's a lot going on. We're going to be talking about this issue of whether the refusal to bow was actually a nationalistic thing, but also, why in the world is Haman using a lottery? Haman is so on it. He wants to get rid of Mordechai. He is so angry. Why in the world is this left to a lottery? And what's the message for us in naming the holiday for the lottery? So that's going to be, God willing, part of next week's year. That's going to be fun. Okay, there were some hands up with questions and comments. Joyce. And for anyone who has to go, you could, please, feel free.
We spent a lot of time discussing with Shoshana Zolty the words after these things because it's an introduction to the Akedah. Does this have any relationship? Is after these things a common phrase in Tanakh, or is this? Can you connect it with the
So it is a common phrase. And what I think I would do, though, to connect it to the Akedah, is the fact that in both cases, we say, wait, after these things is trying to designate some kind of causal relationship. And to say, whatever came before must have led here. And just like over there, they make the tie to Avimelech and to the deal with Avimelech, so too here, we're trying to tie it into the assassination attempt, and that's what the commentators here are doing. So I wouldn't say it's a link between the two stories, but I would say that we bridge in terms of how we approach both of those, and say we have a common understanding of what Achar Hadrim Ha'ela can mean. Yeah, that's what I would say. Thank you. Janine.
Okay, two things. First of all, in terms of Hazani's theory, I just don't get it, because there are dictators today. The Saudi kings or the dictator, what's his name, from Venezuela.
Yeah.
And if you had to, and they think that they're all powerful, but I think you'd be allowed to bow to them if that were the protocol, because they don't. Being a dictator does not really mean that you think you are a god. You may be all powerful. So I just find that
understood. Understood. Like I said, it's a creative read. It's certainly not a halachic read.
It's strange. The other thing I want to say that all the other theories all involve some sort of religious coercion. I believe, if I remember from years ago, the Rambam says during a time, like if a goy would tell you, be Mechalel Shabbat, or I'm going to kill you, you do it to stay alive. But if it's a time of Shema, the time that they're trying to take away your religion and pervert you, even that becomes something we couldn't do. So we don't, whether he wore something on his clothes, or whether he thought he was a dictator, or whether there was some, they might look, the appearance, it's all the same thing. It looks like there's some sort of religious, that's the theory is, that Haman was trying to effect some sort of religious conversion.
Right. So there are two caveats to the issue of being told to do something prohibited. Meaning, I'm not allowed to engage in the big three, right? The idolatry, murder, and sexual immorality. And then separate from that, I'm also not allowed to go along with anything that involves Chilul Hashem, desecrating God's name in public. So a lesser prohibition, but something in public. That's like the Papas and Lulinus case. And in addition to that, if what they're trying to do is specifically to get me to leave Judaism. In other words, a distinction is drawn between a case in which you're walking along the road and suddenly the guy comes up to you and says, eat this cheeseburger or die, in which case let me say it the other way. The case in which you're walking past a field and he says to you, I want you to harvest my stuff now, and you say, well, it's Shabbos, and he says, I don't care, the rain is coming, I need people to harvest this, and I'm going to make you do it. In which case he's clearly doing it for his own benefit, as opposed to the cheeseburger case, in which he's only telling you to do it in order to get you to violate Judaism. That's the Shmad case that you're talking about. So my answer to you, I guess, effectively is that it's the big three plus Chilul Hashem as well as Shmad. That's really the set. And yes, we're seeing that certainly within these explanations. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone, and look forward to next week. And Chag Urim Sameach.